Have you ever watched a horror film with the sound turned right down, or maybe the sound turned completely off? Have you ever sat in a cinema watching a creepy film and had the person behind you rustling their crisps and other assorted snacks, or asking the person sat next to him, "What's he going in there for? What's happening now?" I think you'll agree it does take something away from the experience. Today on Dragon's Teeth, we're talking about creating atmosphere at the gaming table. Hi, I'm Rob Hoyton. Thanks for joining me today for this look at building atmosphere in our games. Now, primarily we're going to be looking at RPGs, of course, but this can apply perhaps to some types of board game, maybe even to some types of tabletop game as well. Before we start, if you could do me a quick favour and click the subscribe button below, as it really does help the channel grow. Thank you. Let's start with the general surroundings and environment then. And I think games are played in one of the set type of environments. We're playing at some sort of convention, we're playing at a club, we're playing at home or at a friend's house, and we're playing online. Each of those comes with their different pros and cons when it comes to helping build this atmosphere. And I mentioned at the start there, RPGs, board games, tabletop games. I suppose in one sense for any type of RPG we want some sort of atmosphere, whether it's fantasy, sci-fi or horror. But I think horror specifically, it really does help with the game and the immersion if we can create some sort of creepiness or tension at the table outside of what is actually going on within the game itself. Let's go over each of those environments to start then. If we're at a convention, we likely have zero control of the environment. We may be in a large room with loads of other games going on, or there might even be trade tables going on, or even talks and lectures. I've seen that happen as well. So there's very little control over what we do. Best case scenario, if you're at an RPG convention, you might be in a conference room somewhere. So at least you are away on your own from the main bulk of the event. You have a bit more peace and quiet. However, you still likely have very little control over the lighting. Most times you're in a modern conference centre, fluorescent strip lights and all the rest of it. So, you know, potentially you've got a bit more of a job there to do to create that atmosphere. If you're playing at a club, it's very likely a similar setup on a much smaller scale. By and large, you'll be in a room with other games going on and all the attendant noise and distractions that can potentially bring. Again, you've probably got very little control over the lighting and you're not really in a position to start playing music or sound effects as it will disturb the other people. So again, that can be a bit of a challenge in creating this tension. At home, of course, now we're getting there. In theory, at least, anyways, depending on who you're living with, you have complete control of the space, lighting, sound, smells, and all the rest of it. So this really, I guess, for building atmosphere is the best place to be. Now, as a side of that, we have the online gaming session as well, which I've recently started doing myself with my Mothership Assault Team 5 campaign, which is going very well. You can see the playthroughs up on the channel here. So that I have some control over the environment, but of course everyone else is sat in their own environment as well. One thing I do find though is that because it's very focused, everyone's focused on the computer screen, that makes it easier in a way to present graphics. And of course, for sound, be it my voice or music or sound effects, then it is completely immersive because everyone has headphones on. So there's pros and cons to each setup, but I think for full control, you can't beat that home experience. Let's look then at some of the things that we can do to help create this atmosphere and build this tension. And we're going to start with the old writing trick, which is when you describe a scene or someone going into the scene, you want to employ all of the senses. In RPGs, particularly back in the day when I think back to our early AD&D games, it was very much visual. You open the door, there's a 40 by 40 room, there's 3 bugbears, there's 2 chests, there's a wardrobe in the corner, and there's some torches on the wall. That's pretty much it. It at that time was kind of a very visually orientated game, and a game based largely around seeing stuff and grabbing it. You know, that was pretty much it. There wasn't a great deal that went into atmosphere, at least in our gaming. That started to change with the appearance of Call of Cthulhu in the early 80s. Now, suddenly we had a game that was specifically about horror. And the great thing with horror games, whether it's mythos or sci-fi or fantasy, as soon as you bring this element of horror in, you get the chance to really build this tension. And of course, horror doesn't have to be one kind of horror. There's body horror, there's cosmic horror, there's the phobia, there's a fear of someone following you, fear of the unknown, the supernatural, all these different aspects, which gives us a very broad canvas to draw on. So we take that same idea, we think of sight, sound, smell, and touch. Now, touch is probably the one that I would use the least. Very rarely at all. Only occasionally can I think I might have done something where you reach out and grab a player's arm, for example. This, of course, is only to be done with a group that you know very well and you're very sure of. In fact, let's just take a step back and say all of these ideas should only be implemented if you're sure about your group. That can be more of a challenge at a convention setting, of course, where you might have met these people for the first time, which is why it's always good either to have your session 0 or at a convention spend 10-15 minutes just saying, look, these are the sort of things that are likely to happen. Is everyone okay with that? You know, we don't want to cause it. We want to cause like fake alarm, but not real alarm, if you know what I mean. We want people to have a good scary experience, but we don't want to leave them feeling upset or triggered. So touch is probably the least used. Having said that, you might introduce it in terms of things like in the game, someone puts their hand in through something and feels something. I could see how you could introduce that into a game. You could have something in a bag full of jelly or whatever it is, and the person has to put their hand in and experience that and describe it. Not something I've ever used myself. I think the nearest I've come was not in an RPG, but when we were watching a film once, a film called Squirm. It might have been a video nasty in the 80s. It's certainly quite a nasty film where, long story short, it's worms. Hundreds and thousands of squiggly worms who become man-eaters. They get the taste for flesh. And in one scene in particular, a young lady is in the shower and she turns the nozzle on and it's getting all her bits and pieces ready, and the worms start coming out of the shower faucet and dripping down. It was at that point that I took some spaghetti I had in the fridge. I just went out to the kitchen, I'm just getting a snack, and I grabbed some of that spaghetti from a bowl, and as I came walking back in, I dropped it down my mate's neck and got a most satisfying reaction. I'm not condoning that sort of thing at the gaming table, you know, but it is food for thought, quite literally. Sound is probably the easiest way to start building an atmosphere. When I was running Vampire the Masquerade, for example, we had an almost continuous soundtrack going of various different types of music from some of the films out at the time. Dracula, Interview with the Vampire, all that kind of stuff, or just general good creepy music, quite often classical music, to keep everything, it was sort of muted, you know, this wasn't blasting out, but it just gave a nice underpinning and kept that atmosphere going throughout the game session. Of course, at certain times you might want that music to reflect what is going on. So if the players move into a particularly tense situation, you might introduce something a little more upbeat or a little more sinister. What I tend to do with Mothership is have ambience. So if they're on a spaceship, there's that ever-present slight hum in the background. Then if something happens, I might put on a little bit of music that is very tense, perhaps jarring, some violins, that kind of stuff. If they're on the space station and they're going into a club, then there'll be some electronic music in the background. Again, you don't want this stuff to drown out what is happening. You want it to be almost just visible. Now, of course, in certain circumstances, that's not possible. If you're playing in the club or that convention space, then the music potentially will either annoy other people, or you have to have it so low that no one can hear it at all. I can't really think of any way around that other than, you know, you go to these museums sometimes and you get the headset. You know, could you do something with that? Everyone has to wear a headset and you pipe them into the music? Maybe. I don't know. That seems like a bit of a stretch, and I'm not sure people would enjoy that in any case. However, if you do have the opportunity, then music is the best way to start introducing atmosphere and tension. Alongside music, we can employ sound in terms of sound effects. These, I think, should be very sparse. You don't want to have a door creak every time someone opens a door, for a couple of reasons. A, you've got to find the thing and how are you playing it, and B, the effects, the novelty wears off very quickly. However, I will have, if we go back to Mothership, for example, if the ship's computer makes an announcement, I'll have that lined up as a sound
Collision
file.
alert. Collision alert. Unidentified object directly ahead.
Or if there's something particularly unusual happens, perhaps the sound of a monster ripping off the door to the cargo bay, then I might put that in as well. But this is online, remember. So this is going straight into the ears. Home setup, you can do that as well quite easily. Maybe club, maybe convention, depending on what's going on. How you deliver this becomes the issue, as it does with music. But nowadays we've got MP3 players, we've got tablets, we've got laptops, you know, we've got phones. It should be quite easy to get that music or sound effect played. Site covers a couple of things. We've got the lighting to think of. As I've said, most often if you're playing convention or club, you're under strip lights, fluorescent lights or LEDs for the most part, which is about the most unatmospheric sort of lighting you can get. Going back to Vampire the Masquerade again, we used to do that at my house when I was living in East London, and we had lights dimmed and candles burning for most of it. Now, of course, you don't want to have it so dark that people can't read their character sheets and you can't read your scenario, but even just dimming the lights a little has that effect of, I think it's something very primal, maybe something that relates to RPGs in general, if you're into the storytelling aspect. This is going back to those times of sitting around the fire and people swapping creepy stories, and you're held in this quiet small circle of firelight, and out beyond is just the darkness, the encroaching gloom. That creates an instant atmosphere. So to some extent, I think what we're looking at doing is getting back to that situation. Maybe that's another venue to play RPGs round a campfire. You know, I'm sure it's been done. If you've done that, let me know. That could be very interesting. We could even be getting into LARP territory there, I imagine. So big room, no real control. If you're in a conference room of some description, then if you get in early as the GM, maybe you can have a quick look at the lighting setup. Perhaps you can flick a couple of the lights off. Perhaps you might want to bring some sort of lamp yourself. I wouldn't recommend candles in public places. There's likely smoke alarms and all that sort of thing. And don't feel that you have to have the lighting the same throughout. It might be, if you've got that fluorescent lighting going, you start with that. At some point during the session, you turn one off. At another point, perhaps you turn another off. Now maybe there's just one strip light left. At some point, maybe you turn that off and go to the little lamp you've got at your side. So a bit like the music, the lighting can change according to what is going on within the game. The other aspect of sight are the visuals of the game itself. If you're round a table, this will normally be in the form of handouts or pictures. Handouts are nice. I remember things from Call of Cthulhu, like the matchbook from a club or something like that. You know, so sometimes they can be tactile as well. If you've got an interesting object, perhaps an odd sculpture or something you've made yourself, you can hand that out. People can look at it, but touch it and feel it as well. The other aspects, of course, is looking at pictures. I particularly like to do this with NPCs. Well, first, I like that player characters have some sort of picture of themselves, and then for NPCs as well. As a GM, it saves you a lot of time in description, and let's face it, description can get a bit rote after a while, a bit stale. She's 5'8" and she's got green hair and da 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 da. Whereas if you present a picture, then that's instant. And of course, you can back this up with certain physical character traits for the person. Oh, you notice he walks with a limp. You notice this and that kind of thing. But a picture is worth 1,000 words, as they say. So again, in a tabletop setting now, you might have printed those out before. You might have things on your tablet or your phone or your laptop. Very easy to present those to the players. The other aspect of that is the same with scenes and settings. This is something that's very easy to do online on Roll20. I can display a picture of the spaceship or of the planet's surface, and of course you can get into maps as well. That might just be a kind of drone's eye view of a space, or it could be a full gridded out dungeon type map of the area they're going into. So that's engaging the player's sight, and again it draws them in a little more. You still need to flesh that out with description, of course, because a 2D map of a dungeon, for example, gives you a basic concept of the space you're working in, but you need to back that up with your descriptions about the dank dripping walls and the slippery moss on the floor and the big spider web in the corner and all that kind of stuff. Which brings us really to the last and in some ways the most important thing, is your skill as a GM in describing a scene, describing a situation, explaining how the action works and the results of the player's actions. It's very easy, and I think back in the day, again going back to our AD&D, all right, you've rolled an 18, roll your damage, the Minotaur takes 5 hits. Okay, cross 5 off, 36 to go. You know, it gets a bit like an exercise in bookkeeping. These days, in the games I run, and certainly in things even like We Want the Gold, my skirmish game, I like to either myself do it or reward players for doing it. A prime example in Mothership was where Steph's character, the robot, went rogue. Don't ask. This big robot goes rogue. It's attacking the crew. Steph's character leaps across the cargo hold, jumps up onto its back and hits the red button. And he described that in great detail and very well, very cinematic. That helps bring a lot of atmosphere and immersion into a game rather than me just saying, okay, well, roll your dice. Okay, you pass, you hit the button. So it's not just down to the GM, it's down to the players as well to help create this atmosphere, because one of the unique things about RPGs is this is a communal effort, if you like. This is not just one person relaying what's going on. Part of the good experience of RPGs is everyone pitching in to help build this narrative. So as a GM, let your players know that they should be involved in this creative process and building this atmosphere just as much as you. And just be aware of how you're presenting information. I've spoken about this in some other uploads here, so take a look at those. But basically think about your tone of voice, the modulation of your voice, the speed that you're presenting information at. Sometimes you want to let things drift out a bit, give the players some time. Other times you should be going, here comes the rat. What are you doing? Now, bang. If they don't make a decision, the rat is on them, you know? So you've got that idea of pacing as well. Also think about stakes. When it comes to tension, you need stakes. In a horror game, if you're up against vampires, you need stakes as well, right? Or maybe you're doing some sort of restaurant-themed RPG. I don't know. But there's got to be some sort of stake because that's what builds the tension. If you get to the stage where players are automatically succeeding in everything, they're almost godlike in their powers, then it's going to get a bit dull for them, I would think. The stakes needn't be that high. It could be something quite simple. But, you know, you're balancing on a stool, trying to fix something or reach something up in the ceiling. The stool starts to wobble. Already, there's an element of tension built in. So look for that as well. And again, before you run the session, think of where those tension points are going to appear in the course of the session. You don't want to have them all in one bit. You want to space these things out a little perhaps, so we get this constant ebb of flow of pace and tension and relaxation. And finally, just one other thing, particularly with horror games, is the role of humour. Now, personally, I think humour has a big role to play in horror. I think writers like Lovecraft, in particular, for example, the role of humour in his writing is often overlooked and underplayed. Of course, other people have taken his writing, like Stuart Gordon, and turned them into horror comedies like Reanimator. Some people don't like that. However, for me, I don't think that Reanimator is very far from the spirit of Lovecraft's original story. So we have this balance. Sometimes you use humour just to take the edge off the horror a bit. And this is a well-known thing if you know people who work in emergency services in particular. For example, my wife does. There's a certain amount of gallows humour that comes along with that just to help people cope with some of the nastiness they have to deal with up close and personal, face to face. So there's an element of that in the game. I think you have to be very careful though. It's a fine line between having that right amount of humour, a tinge of humour, and it going over into farce. I mean, this can be a problem in any RPG. People have jokey names for their characters and, you know, bigger stickers and all this kind of thing. Now, that might work in some games, of course. If you're playing something like Paranoia, then, you know, fair play. But you should be aware as a GM, and maybe this is where we go back to session 0 or that talk at the start, that this is a serious game. Perhaps it's got like adult themes. If we're talking horror, then something nasty is going to be It's going to be happening. So yes, it might be okay to diffuse that to an extent, but we want to be careful not to veer over into full carry-on screaming mode. One of my favourite films, by the way. But, you know, if you're building up the tension nicely at the climax of the scenario and a player character pipes up, "Frying tonight," then that can do a lot to destroy the atmosphere you spent the last half hour building. So, you know, just be aware of that. And if it does start to tip that way, maybe take a break and have a little word with the player involved. There we go then, some ideas that I hope will help you build tension and atmosphere, particularly for your horror gaming. I think for me, music is the go-to. As I said, if you've ever watched a horror film with the sound turned down or turned off, it takes a lot of the atmosphere and tension out of it. So think about that. When it comes to music, well, it kind of depends. If you're doing something in the privacy of your own home, you know, you can use pretty much anything, of course. If you're looking at recording what you do and putting it up onto YouTube or some other public platform, then do be aware of copyright issues. A lot of older classical music is out of copyright. You can get music that is copyright free, but I got caught out on that. When I first started my martial arts channel, I started downloading and using these copyright free musics. little snatches, you know, just idents and bits and pieces at the start of the clip. Yeah, they were copyright free for a couple of years. Then someone bought them up and introduced copyright on them. So all of those videos I had, the income from them, a big part of that now went to the person who owned the copyright of the music at the start. So lessons learned. I'm lucky in that I'm a musician. I've got a home recording set up. I can create my own music. So that's what I tend to do where I can. Even if you're playing music in a public space, or particularly a commercial space, just check, because now it might be a thing that even if you're playing music on a building site, for example, there's a potential that you could need a license to do that, what they call PRS, without going into all that. But if you want to Google it, look up PRS. Now, on the one hand, as a musician, I support that because it's how, as a composer of music, you earn money. Someone plays your music, you get paid, which I'm all for. On the other side, it can be a pain in the arse if you're not sure. Generally speaking, you'll be okay, but err on the side of caution. If you're doing a public game and you want to play music, then just check. Check with the event organisers would be a good starting place. Oh, one final thing I'll touch on as well, because, well, funnily enough, the first time I saw this was not in RPGs at all. In fact, it was from a group of players very diametrically opposed to RPGs and fantasy, way back in the day, Ilford War Games group, in fact, the Napoleonics chaps, most of whom were perfectly fine, perfectly nice, but there are one or two who had something of an attitude, I think we'll call it, which I've mentioned before. As part of the atmosphere building of their Napoleonic games, tabletop wargaming, they wore hats, Napoleonic hats. So, you know, one would have the Napoleon hat, one the Iron Duke, and so on and so on. Great, I have no problem with that at all. So on a tabletop level, if you're doing straight out tabletop wargaming, then the potential to have background music might be there. Perhaps people want to dress in certain ways. Certainly it's something you see at conventions a lot. I was at Salute not long ago, and there was a chap there dressed in a uniform. I think it was possibly a World War One uniform and that kind of stuff. That particularly public game is nice because it's very visual. It draws people in. That person is usually very well versed in the history of what they're doing. So that's a nice introduction and a way to get people interested in whatever game is going on. So that's creating an atmosphere, perhaps for slightly different purposes, but nonetheless, it's something to consider. Okay, that's it for today. I hope there's some ideas there that you can use. If you do have any more, let me know. Pop them down below. Always nice to hear from you. And as I say, if you could click like, share and subscribe, that would be much appreciated. Happy gaming, and I'll see you next time.